Bye. I don't want to see the... I can pop it out and... Alright, so... You ready for the PlayStation 5 reveal event, Matt?
Sure.
You're so glad you've gotten up early in the morning, twice in a row, for an event?
I didn't even know this was going on.
Until I mentioned it.
Like an hour ago, yeah. Like, I was not expecting to do this, but I'm like, you know what? I'm doing this for my friend.
Yeah.
And that's all that matters.
I really hope that doesn't actually look like 360p. I'm going on my phone.
I'll try and read it from my phone as well. See how it looks from my view. Even though my phone is possibly the worst thing to do it.
It does go up to 720p. That's good.
Okay. I'll try and read it. Oh, ow.
I set it to go to 720p myself, so that it'll not, you know, skip around as much. Hey, Fox.
Ugh. Oh, I should tweet or just tweet this out in general.
I'm glad you could make it, Fox.
Okay. And on YouTube.
I'm doing pretty good. How about you, Fox? I don't know how Matt is doing.
I'm
Because he's
doing
not
alright.
saying anything.
I'm doing alright, man. Couldn't be better. Having a fun time.
We're glad you could stop by.
Yeah. Very.
What are you excited to see here, Fox? Any games you expect them to reveal during this? Or do you think they're just going to talk about just the PlayStation itself? I think they might talk about maybe one game and then just purely talk about the console for the rest of the time. I don't see them doing much other than that.
Wow, 5 views.
Yeah, 5 concurrent viewers. Nice.
Yeah.
Welcome,
That's the
everybody.
first. Yeah, should talk.
I'm glad you guys are here, whoever you are.
Yeah.
Even if you're just a lurker who found this live stream, I'm glad you're here. And, you know,
Same.
it's gonna be fun to watch this live stream together.
It sure is, Jacob. I'm sure everyone is excited.
Oh, a few exclusives, yeah. I think you're right, Fox. They'll talk about some exclusives, and then just, I think they'll talk about exclusives very briefly, and then talk about just the console most of the time. But they have to show at least one game, because Xbox has shown at least one game during their reveal, and would be really that would be just a big slap in the face. I know Sony's trying to wait and see what Xbox is doing, but it would be nice if we somehow got a price tag, and that would also force Xbox to reveal their price tag on stuff. That would be nice. I'm gonna do a quick refresh. So many people talking in the chat.
YouTube Premium.
Premiere will begin shortly, thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
Xbox already showed off everything, so... like, they need to step it up and show something. That's why the other day when Xbox revealed even more about the console, I think Sony was like, yeah, we need to show something. Yeah, it'd be nice. I want to know if it's going to have... because Xbox has already been confirmed that it'll have full backwards compatibility from every one of their consoles. Sony has just said that it'll have PlayStation 4 at least. So it would be nice if you could do PlayStation 1, 2, and 3 games along with 4 on the console. So, oh, here we go. Gonna be starting.
For a moment. Oh, of course it's the premiere, yeah. They really could have just streamed this, but okay. Jesus Christ.
Unfortunately, part of the live stream will be a very tiny portion is going to be cut off to the right, on the right side. I can't fix that right now, otherwise the live stream will go down. You still there, Matt?
Yes.
Was it I don't think it was mentioned how long this was, so I have no idea what to expect.
Yeah.
That would be a good idea, Fox. I think something like that. Like, obviously what Nintendo's doing, they're doing sort of something like that. When you pay for their online service, you get some of the old games. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, well, I was at 3.
Hi. Unfortunately,
So you're like
we had
3
to
seconds
cancel
ahead of me.
the talk that we had planned for GDC. But we do have some super exciting news about PS5. And who better to bring that to you than the one and only Mark Cerny. Without further ado, over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Jim. There will be lots of chances later on this year to look at the PlayStation 5 games. Today, I want to talk a bit about our goals for the PlayStation 5 hardware and how they influenced the development of the console.
So no games?
I think you all know I'm a big believer in console
no
generation.
Smash.
Once every 5 or 6 or 7 years,
Yeah, where's Smash Bros?
There's a
Yeah,
lot of
come on,
learning by the
Sony,
game
get on that.
developers, hopefully not too overwhelming, and soon there's games that could never have been created before. Now, it used to be that as a console designer, you'd somehow intuit what would be the best set of capabilities for the new console, and then build it in complete secrecy. For the PlayStation consoles, that period lasted through PlayStation 3, a powerful and groundbreaking console, but also one that
cost $700 on
as it was
release.
initially difficult to develop games for. So, starting with PlayStation 4, we've taken a different approach, roughly centered around 3 principles. The first of these is listening to the developers, which is to say
Yeah,
that
they do
a
sound
lot of
very
what we
stressed
put into
out,
the console
Fox.
derives directly from the needs and aspirations of the game creators. We definitely do have some ideas of our own, but at the core of our philosophy for designing consoles is that game players are here for the fantastic games, which is to say that game creators matter. Anything we can do to make life easier for the game creators or help them realize their dreams, we will do. So, about once every 2 years, I take a tour of the industry. I go to the various developers and publishers, sit down, and discuss how they're doing with the current consoles and what they'd like to see in future consoles. This requires weeks on the road, as reaching the bulk of the game creators involves talking to well over 100 people at something like 24 publishers and developers. And it is incredibly valuable. By the way, the feature most requested by the developers, that was
Oh, no.
an SSD, which we were very happy to put in the hardware, but a lot of problem solving was required. I'll be doing a deep dive on the SSD and surrounding systems later on in this talk. It's also key to make a generational leap while keeping the console sufficiently
I'm very
familiar
bored.
to game developers. I think about this in terms of
Same.
balancing evolution and revolution. Now, with PlayStation 1, 2, and 3, the
I'm here
target
against
was
my will.
revolution each time with a brand new feature set. That was great in many
just
ways,
because
but
I have a
time
gun
for the
up
developers
against your
to get
head
up and running
means
got
nothing.
longer with each console. In the past, I've called this
Yeah, those are fake cutouts, I think,
Here's what I had
Fox.
for
I'm
those
pretty
3
sure.
consoles.
Those are
I'm not
definitely
talking
fake
about
people.
time to make a game.
I mean, they
Developers
should
will be
be.
ambitious, and it may take them 6 years or so to realize their vision. What I'm talking about is that dead time before graphics and other aspects of game development are up and running, and trying to minimize that. On the other hand, if we're trying to reduce that dead time to 0, that means the hardware architecture can't change
Yeah, the
at all.
stalling.
We're handcuffed. We need to judge for
I have
each
not been
feature
paying
what
attention
value
at
it
all.
adds, and whether it's worth the increase in
It's really
developer time
not
needed to
nothing.
support it.
But this isn't live
So with
anyway. This is
PlayStation 4,
recorded.
we were able to strike a
Yeah.
pretty good balance between performance and familiarity. We got
I was hoping for a
required
live
learning back
stream.
to PlayStation 1 levels.
Yeah.
With PS5, the GPU
But
was
I mean,
definitely
with the
the area that felt
coronavirus,
the most
I
tension
understand why they
between
won't.
adding new features and keeping a familiar programming model. Ultimately, I think we've ended up with something under a month of getting up to speed. That feels like we're striking about the right balance. I'll go into a bit more detail later today about our philosophy with the GPU and the specific feature set that resulted from it. It's also very important for us, as the hardware team, to find new dreams, by which I mean something other than CPU performance, GPU performance, and the amount of RAM. The increase in graphics performance over the past 2 decades has been astonishing.
Wait a minute, one of the
There are
cutouts
other areas
moved.
in which we can innovate and provide significant
Okay,
value to
that
the
one's
game
you.
creators, and through them, the players.
That just came
That's why
alive.
the SSD was very much on our list of directions to explore, regardless of what came out of the conversation
Oh, it's moving.
with developers and publishers. The biggest feature in this
Sentient.
category is the custom engine for audio. That's today's final topic. The push for vastly improved audio, and in particular 3D audio, isn't something that came
Listen,
out
stop
of
zooming in and
development.
out on
It's
that
much more the case that we
fake-ass
had a
TV
dream of
because
what
it looks
might
like
be
my
possible
streams
5
cutting
years
out
from
when you
now,
do that.
and then worked out a number
But
of
it's
steps
not.
we could take to set us on that path. So here again are the 3 principles, the first being enabling the desires of developers to drive the hardware design. To me, the SSD really is the key to the next generation. It's a game changer. And it was the #1
Right,
ask from
Fox?
developers
It was
for PlayStation
creepy.
5. As in, we know it's probably impossible, but can you put an SSD in it? That was a discussion we were also having internally. It was clear that the presence of a hard drive in every PlayStation 4 was having a positive impact. A lot of things that would simply have been impossible at Blu-ray disc speeds were now possible. At the same time, though, in 2015 and 2016, when we were having these conversations, developers were already banging up against the limits of the hard drive. And a lot of developer time was being spent designing around slow load speeds. I want to focus in on just one number here, which is how long it takes to load a gigabyte of data from a hard drive. The difficulty being that hard drives are neither particularly fast nor flexible. If all your data is in one block, which is frankly not very likely, you can load 50 to 100 megabytes a second, depending on where the data is located on the hard drive. Let's assume it's on the outer edge, which means loading a gigabyte takes 10 seconds. If you compress your game packages, you can fit more data on the Blu-ray disc and also effectively boost your hard drive read speed by the compression ratio.
Incredibly
We support zlib decompression on PlayStation 4 that gets you something like 50% more data on the disc and 50% higher effective read speed. Unfortunately, though, it's highly likely that your data is scattered around in various files on the hard drive, as well as sourced from
So this is how you guys roll about sports.
So lots of seeks
I
are
blame
needed
this
at
on you,
2
Matt.
to 50-ish milliseconds
Oh.
each. My rule of thumb is
I
that
have
the
no
hard
reason
drive is
to,
spending
just
2/3 of its time seeking, and only a third of its time actually loading data. Putting all of that together, a gigabyte
I mean,
is
I'll
very
leave
roughly
if you
20
want me
seconds
to.
load from
Nah.
a hard drive. Now, a
I
gigabyte
mean,
is
no
not much
nonsense.
data. Games are using 5 or 6 gigabytes of RAM on PlayStation 4, so boot times and load times can get pretty grim. Or to put that differently, as a player, you wait for the game to boot, wait for the game to load, wait for the level to reload every time you die, and you wait for what is euphemistically called fast travel. And all of that leads to the dream. What if we could have not just an SSD, but a blindingly fast SSD? If we could load 5 gigabytes a second from it, what would change? Now, SSDs are completely different from hard drives. They don't have seeks as such. If you have a 5 gigabyte a second SSD, you can read data from 1,000 different locations in that second, pretty much at speed. As for time to load a gigabyte, this is next gen we're talking about, so memory is bigger. Instead, we should be asking how long to load 2 gigabytes. And the answer is about 1/4 of a second. I mean, that's amazing. We're talking 2 orders of magnitude, meaning very roughly 100 times faster. Which means at 5 gigabytes a second for the SSD, the potential is that the game boots in a second. There are no load screens. The
I'm
game just
glad
fades
it'll be
down while loading
fast,
a half
but
dozen gigabytes.
Xbox is also doing this, so
Same
I
for
don't
a
care.
reload. You're immediately back in the action after you die. And fast travel becomes so fast it's blink and you miss it. As game creators, we go from trying to distract the player from how long fast travel is taking, like those Spider-Man subway rides, to being so blindingly fast that we might even have to slow that transition down. Pretty cool, right? But for me, this is not the primary reason to change from a hard drive to an SSD.
I like how the chat
primary
is
reason
just
for an
full of
ultra-fast
Z's.
SSD is that it gives the game designer
That's like the most
freedom.
entertaining part
Or
so
to put
far.
that differently, with a hard drive, the 20 seconds that it takes to load a gigabyte can sabotage the game that the developer is trying to create. I think almost all of us in the room have experienced this, maybe in different ways. Say we're making an adventure game and we have 2 rich environments where we each want enough textures and models to fill memory. Which you can
Sony's
do
gonna
as long as
flop,
you have a
you
long
think,
staircase
Fox?
or elevator ride or a windy corridor where you can ditch the old assets and then take
I-
30
I-
seconds or so
I
to
don't
load the new
think
assets.
so.
Having a 30-second
Well,
elevator
maybe
ride is
not
a little extreme.
flop,
More realistically, we'd probably
but
chop the world into a number of
quite a
smaller
boring
pieces and then do some calculations with
reveal
sight
event.
lines and
I
run
think this
speeds
seems like
we
it was
did
just
for
made
Haven
just for,
City
like,
when we were making Jack 2. The
stock
game
people.
is 20 years old, but not much has changed since then. All those twisty passages are there for a reason. There's a whole subset of level design dedicated to this sort of work, but still, it's a giant distraction for a team that just wants to make their game. So when I talked about the dream of an SSD, part of the reason for that 5 gigabyte a second target was to eliminate loads, but also part of the reason for that target was streaming. As in, what if the SSD is so fast that as the player is turning around, It's possible to load textures for everything behind the player in that split second. If you figure that it takes half a second to turn, that's 4 gigabytes of compressed data you can load. That sounds about right for next gen. Anyway, back to the hard drive. Another strategy for increasing effective read speed is to make big sequential chunks of data. For example, we might group all the data together for each city block. That removes most of the seeks, and the streaming gets faster. But there's a downside too, which is that frequently used data is included in many chunks and therefore is on the hard drive many, many times. Marvel's Spider-Man uses this strategy, and though it works very well for increasing the streaming speed, there's a massive duplication as a result. Some of the objects like mailboxes or news racks are on the hard drive 400 times. What I'm describing here are things that cramp a creative director's style. Either level design gets a little bit boring in places, or the data is duplicated so many times that it no longer fits on the Blu-ray disc. And you end up with hard limits on the player's run speed or driving speed. The player can't go faster than the load speed from the hard drive. And finally, I'm sure many of you have noticed that after a patch download, a PlayStation 4 will sometimes take a long time to install the patch. That's because when just part of a file has been changed, the new data can be downloaded pretty quickly. But before the game boots up, a brand new file has to be constructed that includes the changed portion. Otherwise, every change would add a seek or two. Even so, you can occasionally see this happening on game titles. They start to hitch once they get patched enough. With an SSD, though, no seeks, so no need to make brand new files with the changes incorporated into them, which means no installs as you know them today. There's yet one more benefit, which is that system memory can be used much more efficiently.
One more benefit.
On PlayStation 4, game data on the hard drive feels very distant and difficult to use. By the time you realize you need a piece of data, it's much too late to go out and load it. So system memory has to contain all of the data that could be used in the next 30 seconds or so of gameplay. That means a lot of the 8 gigabytes of system memory is idle. It's just waiting there to be potentially used. On PlayStation 5, though, the SSD is very close to being like more RAM. Typically, it's fast enough that when you realize you need a piece of data, you can just load it from the SSD and use it. There's no need to have lots of data parked in system memory waiting to potentially be used. A different way of saying that is that most of RAM is working on the game's behalf. This is one of the reasons that 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 feels right for PlayStation 5. The presence of the SSD reduces the need for a massive intergenerational increase in size. So back to the dream of the SSD. Here's the set of targets. Boot the game in a second, no load screens, design freedom, meaning no twisty passages or long corridors, more game on the disk and more game on the SSD, and finally, those patch installs go away. The reality, though, is that the SSD is just one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of places where bottlenecks can occur in between the SSD and the game code that uses the data. You can see this on PlayStation 4. If I use an SSD with 10 times the speed of a standard hard drive, I probably see only double the loading speed, if that. For PlayStation 5, our goal was not just that the SSD itself be 100 times faster. It was that game loads and streaming would be 100 times faster. So every single potential bottleneck needed to be addressed. And there are a lot of them. Let's look at check-in and what happens when its overhead gets 100 times larger. Conceptually, check-in is a pretty simple process. Data is loaded into system memory from the hard drive or SSD. It's examined, a few values are tweaked to check it in, and then it's moved to its final location. At the SSD speeds we're talking about, that last part, moving the data, meaning copying it from one location to another, takes roughly an entire next-gen CPU core. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. If all the overheads get 100 times larger, that will cripple the frame rate as soon as the player moves, and that massive stream of data starts coming off the SSD. So to solve all of that, we built a lot of custom hardware.
Matt, I'm looking up on my other computer, I'm looking at
of custom units
all the chat.
The flash controller in the
I don't know if you are, but literally everyone's typing in ZZZZZZZZ.
games in mind. For example, there are 6 levels of priority when reading.
Other people are saying, shut up.
Priority is very important. You can imagine
or
the player
down.
heading into some new location in the world and the game
everyone is so freaking bored
of textures. And while those textures are being loaded, and
If they don't show the console in the next 5 minutes,
having multiple
Jacob,
priority levels lets the audio for those
I am
words
leaving.
get loaded
and
immediately.
I want you to know it's not because of
On
you.
one side,
Don't
that
leave.
flash controller connects
Please.
to actual flash dies that supply the storage. To reach our bandwidth target of 5 gigabytes a second, we ended up with a 12-channel interface. 8 channels wouldn't be enough. The resulting bandwidth we've achieved is actually 5.5 gigabytes a second. With a 12-channel interface, the most natural size that emerges for an SSD is 825 gigabytes. The key question for us was, is that enough? I mean, it's tempting to add more, but flash certainly doesn't come cheap, and we have a responsibility to our gaming audience to be cost-effective with regards to what we put in the console.
Doesn't come cheap.
Ultimately, we
So are you
resolved this
hinting that
question
the
by looking at the
PS5 is
play
going to be
patterns of a broad
really
range of
expensive?
gamers. We examined the
Are you
specific
going to do
games
another
that they were playing over the course of a
$700
weekend or a
console
week
launch?
or a month, and whether that set of games would fit properly on the SSD. We were able to establish that the friction caused by reinstalls or
dear
re-downloads
Lord.
would be quite low. And so we locked in on that 825 gigabyte size, while also preparing multiple strategies so that those who want more storage can add it. I'll go through the details in a moment.
Wait,
Back to the flash controller. On the
is he
other
saying
side,
the hard
connects to our
drive is
main
going to
custom
be
chip via 4 lanes
825
of Gen 4
gigabytes?
PCIe. And inside the main custom chip
It's
is
a pretty dumb
hefty
frickin' number.
unit dedicated to I/O. Before we talk about what that does, let's talk compression for a moment. PlayStation 4 used zlib as its compression format. We decided to use it again
This was
on
definitely
PlayStation
made
5,
just
but
for
on my
developers.
2017 tour of developers, I learned about a new format called Kraken from Rad Game Tools.
But
It's
I
like
honestly think
zlib's
this is all they
smarter version.
had,
Simple,
and they didn't
similar
have
types of algorithms, but
anything
about
else to talk
10%
about.
better compression, which is pretty big. That means 10% more game.
Or
on
else,
the UHD
or maybe they
disk
just
or on
didn't want
the
to talk
SSD.
about anything
Kraken had only been out
else
for a
right
year, but it was
now.
already becoming a
As
de
they're
facto
waiting
industry
for
standard. Half of the teams I
June,
talked to were either
when
using
usually
it or getting
E3 would
ready
go
to
off, and that's when
evaluate
they would have their
so
own
we
live stream.
hustled and built a custom decompressor into the I/O unit, one capable of handling over 5
This is
gigabytes
incredibly
of Kraken
boring.
format input data a second. After decompression, that typically becomes 8 or 9 gigabytes, but the unit itself is capable of outputting as much as 22 gigabytes a second if the data happen to compress particularly well. By the way, in terms of performance, that custom
I don't
decompressor equates
care.
to 9
It's
of our
boring.
Zen 2 cores. That's what it would take to decompress the Kraken stream with a conventional CPU. There's a lot more in the custom I/O unit, including a dedicated DMA controller. The game can direct exactly where it wants to send the data coming off of the SSD. This equates to another Zen 2 core or two in terms of its copy performance. Its primary purpose is to remove check-in as a bottleneck. There's 2 dedicated I/O coprocessors and a large RAM pool. These aren't Zen 2 cores. They're there principally to direct the variety of custom hardware around them.
Oh God!
One of the
I'm so
coprocessors
sorry.
is dedicated to SSD I/O. This lets us bypass traditional file I/O and its bottlenecks when reading from the SSD. The other is responsible for memory mapping, which I know doesn't sound like anything related to the SSD, but a lot of developers map and remap memory as part of file I/O, and this too can become a bottleneck. There are coherency engines to assist the coprocessors. Coherency comes up a lot in places. Probably the biggest coherency issue is stale data in the GPU caches. Flushing all of the GPU caches whenever the SSD is read is an unattractive option. It could really hurt the GPU performance. So we've implemented
Angry
a
Joe
gentler way of doing
tweeted,
things, where the
this is very
coherency
weird.
engines inform the GPU of the overwritten address ranges, and custom scrubbers in several dozen GPU caches do pinpoint evictions of just those address ranges. The best thing is, as a game developer, when you read from the SSD, you don't need to know any of this. You don't even need to know that your data is compressed. You just indicate what data you'd like to read from your original uncompressed file and where you'd like to put it, and the whole process of loading it happens invisibly to you and at very high speed. Back to the dream. Thanks to all of that surrounding hardware, our 5.5 gigabytes a second really should translate into something like 100 times faster I/O than PS4 and
Oh,
allow
shit.
the dream of
Please
no
tell me
load
they're done with the
speeds and
SSD.
super fast streaming to become a reality. Having said that, expandability of our SSD is going to be quite important. Flash is costly, and you may very well want to add storage to whatever we put in the console. Now, the kind of storage you need depends on how you're going to use it. If you have an extensive PlayStation 4 library and you'd like to take advantage of backwards compatibility to play those games on PlayStation 5, then a large external hard drive is ideal. You can leave your games on the hard drive and play them directly from there, thus saving the pricier SSD storage for your PlayStation 5 titles, or you can copy your active PlayStation 4 titles to the SSD. If your purpose in adding more storage is to play PlayStation 5 titles, though, ideally you would add to your SSD storage. We will be supporting certain M2 SSDs. These are internal drives that you can get on the open market and install in a bay in the PlayStation 5. As for which ones we support and when, I'll get to that in a moment. They connect through the custom I/O unit just like our SSD does, so they can take full advantage of the decompression, I/O coprocessors, and all the other features I was talking about. Here's the catch, though. That commercial drive has to be at least as fast as ours. Games that rely on the speed of our SSD need to work flawlessly with any M2 drive. When I gave the Wired interview last year, I said that the PlayStation 5 SSD was faster than anything available on PC. At the time, commercial M2 drives used PCIe 3.0, and 4 lanes of that cap out at 3.5 gigabytes a second. In other words, no PCIe 3.0 drive can hit the required spec. M2 drives with PCIe 4.0 are now out in the market. We're getting our samples
I'm sorry,
and
Matt.
seeing 4 or 5 gigabytes a second from them.
Right.
By year's end, I expect there will be drives that saturate 4.0 and support 7 gigabytes a second. Having said that, we are
I didn't know it was
comparing
gonna be this
apples
boring.
and oranges, though, because that commercial
Yeah.
M2 drive will have its own architecture, its own flash controller, and so on. For example, the NVMe specification lays out a priority scheme for requests that the M2 drives can use. And that scheme is pretty nice, but it only has 2 true priority levels. Our drive supports 6. We can hook up a drive with only 2 priority levels, definitely, but our custom I/O unit has to arbitrate the extra priorities rather than the M2 drive's flash controller.
Well,
And
I
so
already
the
saw
M2
someone
drive
post
needs a
all the
little extra speed to
specs
take care of issues
on
arising from the different approach.
Twitter, and I put
That
3 of
commercial
them.
drive also needs to physically fit
We were
inside of the
correct
bay
that
we
the
created in
PlayStation
PlayStation 5
is
for M2 drives.
weaker,
Unlike internal hard drives, there's
but it
unfortunately
has a
no
faster
standard for the height
hard
of an M2
drive.
drive. And some M2 drives have giant heat sinks. In fact, some of them
But
even
that's
have their
all
own fans. Right now, we're
really-
getting M2 drive samples and benchmarking them in various ways. When games hit beta as they get ready for the PlayStation 5 launch at
Yeah.
year end, we'll also be
Oh,
doing
it's-
some compatibility testing to make sure that the architecture of particular M2
Yep.
drives isn't too foreign for the games to handle. Once we've done that
Interesting.
compatibility testing, we should be able to start letting you know which drives will physically fit and which drive samples have benchmarked appropriately high in our testing. It would be great if that happened by launch, but it's likely to be a bit past it. So please hold off on getting that M2 drive until you hear from us. Okay, back to our principles. Balancing evolution and revolution is the second of them. This was definitely a recurring theme with the GPU. We need new GPU features and capabilities. If we only have more performance, it's not really a new generation of console. Of course, many of these capabilities result in more performance. That's part of why a PlayStation 5 teraflop is more powerful than a PlayStation 4 teraflop. But we aren't just looking for the performance. We also need the ability to do something with the GPU that could not have been done before. And we need higher performance per watt. Every time we double the performance of some GPU component, we don't want to find out we've doubled the power consumed and the heat produced. But at the same time, we have to make sure the GPU can run PS4 games, and we have to ensure that the architecture is easy for the developers to adopt. Now, backwards compatibility was handled masterfully by AMD. They treated it as a key need throughout the design process. As our solution to adding new features without blindsiding developers, we made sure that if there were new significant features, it would be optional to use them. The GPU supports ray tracing, but you don't have to use ray tracing to make your game. The GPU supports primitive shaders, but you can release your first game on PlayStation 5 without making any use of them. Before I get into the capabilities of the GPU, I'd like to make clear 2 points that can be quite confusing. First, we have a custom AMD GPU based on their RDNA 2 technology. What does that mean? AMD is continuously improving and revising their tech.
No
For
one's really
RDNA2,
watching
Their
this.
goals were, roughly speaking, to reduce power consumption by re-architecting the GPU to put data close to where it's needed, to optimize the GPU
I don't know if
for
we can play
performance, and
Minecraft
to add a
after this,
new,
Fox.
more advanced feature set. But that feature set is malleable, which is to say that we have
I don't really
our own
have
needs for
anything
PlayStation,
set up
and
for
that can
Minecraft
factor
right
into
now.
what the AMD roadmap becomes. So collaboration is born.
I mean, maybe
If we
Matt
bring
can do that.
concepts to
I don't
AMD
know.
that are felt to be widely useful, then they can be adopted into RDNA2 and used broadly, including in PC GPUs. If the
That's something I
ideas
would
are
have to
sufficiently
plan.
specific to what we're trying to accomplish, like the GPU cache scrubbers I was talking about, then they end up being just for us. If you see a similar discrete GPU available as a PC card at roughly the same time as we release our console, that means our collaboration
like we
with
mentioned
AMD
during the
succeeded.
Animal
In
Crossing
producing
Direct,
technology
Fox,
useful in both worlds.
we will be
It
doing
doesn't mean that we
a lot of
as
live
simply
streams
incorporated the PC part
with
into our console. This
Animal
continuous
Crossing,
improvement in AMD
so
technology
that you will
means
be able to
it's
join
dangerous to rely on teraflops as an absolute
and,
indicator of performance.
going onto
And
our
CPU
islands and
count
play
should
with
be
us.
avoided as well. In the
So,
case of CPUs, we all understand
we'll be
this. The
doing a lot
PlayStation
more
4
live
and
streams.
PlayStation 5 each have 8 CPUs, but we never think that meant the capabilities and performance are equal. It's the same for CUs. For one thing, they've been getting much larger over time. Adding new features means adding lots of transistors. In fact, the transistor count for a PlayStation 5 CU is 62% larger than the transistor count for a PlayStation 4 CU. Second, the PlayStation 5 GPU is backwards compatible with PlayStation 4. What does that mean?
I don't know.
One way you can achieve
2 more
backwards
days
compatibility is to put the previous console's chipset
Animal
in the
Crossing
new
will be
console,
out.
like we did with some PlayStation 3s. But that's, of course, extremely expensive. A better way is to incorporate any differences in the previous console's logic into the new console's custom chips, meaning that even as the technology evolves, the logic and feature set that PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro titles rely on is still available in backwards compatibility modes. One advantage of this strategy is that once backwards compatibility is in the console, it's in. It's not as if a cost down will remove backwards compatibility like it did on PlayStation 3. Achieving this unification of functionality took years of efforts by AMD, as any roadmap advancement creates a potential divergence in logic. Running PS4 and PS4 titles at boosted frequencies has also added complexity. The boost is truly massive this time around, and some game code just can't handle it.
So,
testing has to be done on a title-by-title basis. Results are excellent.
If I had known
we recently took a look
before
at the top 100 PlayStation
that this was
4
supposed to be
titles as
shown at
ranked by
GDC,
Playtime, and we're expecting
Game Developer
almost all of them
Conference,
to be playable
I would
at
have
launch
canceled the
on
stream
PlayStation 4.
immediately.
With regards
Because
to new
Game
features,
Developer
as I
Conference
said, our
is
strategy was to
for
try
game
to break new
developers.
ground, but at the same time not to require use of the new GPU capabilities. For more than a decade, GPUs have imposed a restriction on game engines. Software handles vertex processing, but
This
for the
is
most
quite
part,
boring.
dedicated
This is meant
hardware
for
is responsible
developers.
for the triangles and other geometry that the vertices form. That means it's not possible to
A lot
do
of people
even
didn't
basic
understand
optimizations,
that.
such
That's
as
why everyone's
aborting
super
processing
bored.
of a vertex if all geometry
And
that
Matt
uses
hasn't
it
said a
is
single
off-screen.
thing because I think he left.
PlayStation 5 has a new unit called the Geometry Engine, which brings handling of triangles and other primitives under full programmatic control. As a game developer, you're free to ignore its existence and use the PlayStation 5 GPU as if it were no more capable
he didn't
than the
leave,
PS4
but he's
GPU.
not talking.
Or you can use this new intelligence in various
Just said
ways.
this made me dead inside.
Simple usage could be performance optimization, such as removing backfaced or off-screen vertices and triangles. More complex usage involves something called primitive shaders, which allow the game to synthesize geometry on the fly as it's being
he's
rendered.
dead.
It's a brand new capability. Using primitive shaders on PlayStation 5 will allow for a broad variety of techniques, including smoothly varying level of detail, addition of procedural detail to close-up objects, and improvements to particle effects and other visual special effects. Another major new feature of our custom RDNA2 based GPU
I'm only
is
sticking
ray
by
tracing,
because I
using
really
the
want to
same
see what
strategy
it
as
looks like
AMD's
if they
upcoming
reveal that.
PC GPUs. The CUs contain a new specialized unit called the intersection engine, which can calculate the intersection of rays with boxes and triangles. To use the intersection engine, first you build what is called an acceleration structure. It's data in RAM that contains all of your geometry. There's a specific set of formats you can use. They're variations on the same BVH concept. Then, in your shader program, you use a new instruction that asks the intersection engine to check a ray against the BVH. While the intersection engine is processing the requested ray triangle or ray box intersections, the shaders are free to do other work. Having said that, the ray tracing instruction is pretty memory intensive, so it's a good mix with logic-heavy code. There's of course no need to use ray tracing. PS4 graphics engines will run just fine on PlayStation 5, but it presents an opportunity for those interested. I'm thinking it'll take less than 1 million rays a second to have a big impact on audio. That should be enough for audio occlusion and some reverb calculations. With a bit more of the GPU invested in ray tracing, it should be possible to do some very nice global illumination. Having said that, adding ray-traced shadows and reflections to a traditional graphics engine could easily take hundreds of millions
you think it'll still look like that B design?
And full ray tracing.
I certainly hope
billions.
not.
How far can we go? I'm starting to get quite bullish. I've already seen a PlayStation 5 title that's successfully using ray tracing-based reflections in complex animated scenes with only modest costs. Another set of issues for the GPU involve size and frequency. How big do we make the GPU, and what frequency do we run it at? This is a balancing act. The chip has a cost, and there's a cost for whatever we use to supply that chip with power and to cool it. In general, I like running the GPU at higher frequency. Let me show you why. Here's 2 possible configurations for a GPU roughly of the level of the PlayStation 4 Pro. This is a thought experiment. Don't take these configurations too seriously. If you just calculate teraflops, you get the same number. But actually, the performance is noticeably different because teraflops is defined as the computational capability of the vector ALU. That's just one part of the GPU. There are a lot of other units. And those other units all run faster when the GPU frequency is higher. At 33% higher frequency, rasterization goes 33% faster. Processing the command buffer goes that much faster. The L2 and other caches have that much higher bandwidth, and so on. About the only downside is that system memory is 33% further away in terms of cycles. But the large number of benefits more than counterbalance that. As a friend of mine says, a rising tide lifts all boats. Also, it's easier to fully use 36 CUs in parallel than it is to fully use 48 CUs. When triangles are small, it's much harder to fill all those CUs with useful work. So there's a lot to be said for faster, assuming you can handle the resulting power and heat issues, which frankly, we haven't always done the best job at. Part of the reason for that is, historically, our process for setting CPU and GPU frequencies has relied on some heavy-duty guesswork with regards to how much electrical power games will consume and how much heat will be produced as a result inside of the console. Power consumption varies a lot from game to game. When I play God of War on my PS4 Pro, I know the power consumption is high just by the fan noise. But power isn't simply about engine quality. It's about the minutiae of what's being displayed and how. It's counterintuitive, but processing dense geometry typically consumes less power than processing simple geometry, which is, I suspect, why Horizon's map screen, with its low triangle count, makes my PS4 Pro heat up so much. Our process on previous consoles has been to try to guess what the maximum power consumption during the entire console lifetime might be, which is to say, the worst case scene in the worst case game, and prepare a cooling solution that we think will be quiet at that power. If we get it right, fan noise is minimal. If we get it wrong, the console will be quite loud for the higher power games, and there's even a chance that it might overheat and shut down if we misestimate power too badly. PlayStation 5 is especially challenging because the CPU supports 256-bit native instructions that consume a lot of power. These are great here and there, but presumably only minimally used. Or are they? If we plan for major 256-bit instruction usage, we need to set the CPU clock substantially lower or noticeably increase the size of the power supply and fan. So, after much discussion, we decided to go with a very different direction on PlayStation 5. We built a GPU with 36 CUs. Mind you, RDNA2 CUs
Fox,
are large.
just gonna
Each
go
has
now.
62% more transistors than the CUs
Really
we were
boring.
using on PlayStation 4. So if we compare transistor counts,
Yeah.
36 RDNA2
Thanks for
CUs
stopping
equates to
by.
roughly 58
Yes.
PlayStation
Thank
4
you,
CUs.
Fox, and
It
anyone
is a
who
fairly
showed up
sizable
in Game
GPU.
Talk.
Then we went with a variable frequency
Sorry.
engine for PlayStation 5,
We'll be
which
doing
is
a
to
lot
say
more
we
stuff later
continuously
on.
run the GPU and
Yeah.
CPU in boost mode.
We're gonna try and
We
do,
supply
and we're
a
kind of
generous
saying,
amount of electrical
Just
power,
wish I knew
and then increase the
this was-
frequency
this
of GPU and
presentation
CPU until they
just
reach
was-
the capabilities of the system's
was,
cooling
I would
solution.
not
It's a completely different paradigm. Rather than running at
Yeah.
constant frequency and letting power vary based on the workload, we run at essentially